Let's spend some time talking about Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. This relatively short novel was published in 1847 under Emily Bronte's pen name, Ellis Bell. The Bronte sisters' works are often considered the final works of the classic European Gothic era. As we discussed when we studied the introduction to the European Gothic, its popularity was tied to a rise in female readership. Wuthering Heights is an excellent example of that connection. It is the classic Gothic romance. It includes 3 love stories that span 2 generations, but as our selection highlighted, it also involves supernatural horror. The selection in our text is an excellent choice for a course in horror literature because it presents an encounter with a ghost. The novel on the whole is the story of 2 intertwined families, the Earnshaws and the Lintons, and their estates. Wuthering Heights is a remote farm estate on the moors of England owned by the Earnshaw family. In the selection we have, a man named Lockwood has rented the nearest estate, Thrushcross Grange, which throughout most of the novel is owned by a family of landed gentry named the Lintons. In our selection, Lockwood visits the much less elegant and wilder Wuthering Heights and is forced by weather to spend the night where he has an encounter with the ghost of a young girl. But the selection we have is somewhat misleading in terms of the full novel. In our selection, Lockwood declares that Wuthering Heights is filled with ghosts, and that selection indicates he's right. But Wuthering Heights is actually an unusual ghost story that's filled with ambiguity, much of which turns on this scene. In most ghost stories, the hero tries to escape being hunted by a ghost. But in Wuthering Heights, the hero, Heathcliff, spends the entire novel attempting to get Catherine's ghost to haunt him. Now, the first half of the novel focuses on a love triangle between Catherine Earnshaw, Heathcliff, and Edgar Linton. Heathcliff is an orphan that Catherine's father picks up on the streets of London and brings home. When Catherine's father dies, her brother Hindley inherits Wuthering Heights, and he allows Heathcliff to remain as a servant, whom Hindley treats rather cruelly. But Catherine and Heathcliff continue to spend all of their time together, building a relationship that is so close that Catherine states at one point, "I am Heathcliff." Catherine and Heathcliff enjoy life running free on the moors until they decide to spy on their new neighbors, the Lintons. While they're spying, Catherine is bitten by one of the Lintons' dogs and is taken into the house, where she spends considerable time recuperating. Although Catherine and Heathcliff originally make fun of the cultured Lintons, Catherine adapts to their lifestyle and returns to Wuthering Heights changed. Now, while she's recuperating, Edgar Linton also has become enraptured with Catherine. Eventually, Catherine agrees to marry Edgar, although she loves him differently and less than she loves Heathcliff. Now, Catherine's marriage breaks Heathcliff's heart irrevocably and sets off a series of events that heap tragedy on tragedy and cruelty on cruelty. Catherine and Heathcliff remain in contact until Catherine dies, delivering her only child, whom Edgar names Cathy. But it's actually Catherine's death that introduces us to a major focus of the novel, which is Heathcliff's lifelong pursuit of Catherine's ghost, which was demonstrated in the clip from the film that we watched before we started this discussion. Although the love story between Heathcliff and Catherine is the central aspect of the novel that everything else springs from, much of the novel focuses on what happens after Catherine dies. Heathcliff's life had been all but destroyed by her marrying Edgar, but his search for her ghost becomes a torturing obsession for Heathcliff and destroys what little life is left in him. Now, rumors are circulating about Wuthering Heights being haunted, as Lockwood remarks in the selection we read. Heathcliff becomes convinced that Catherine is there, looking for him. None of the people around him matter to him at all, except as they are related to Catherine and in his attempts to reunite with her. Interacting with them is a distraction because they simply do not matter. As we will discuss, he treats them cruelty, all the while looking for Catherine's ghost. This obsession explains why Heathcliff is so angry with Lockwood in the selection we read. Heathcliff feels cheated and jealous. He has spent his life looking for Catherine's ghost, and this stranger who never met her and has no legitimate place at Wuthering Heights gets to see Catherine, while Heathcliff, who loves her more than life itself, doesn't get to see her. This tortured obsession follows him even onto his deathbed. Now, although Wuthering Heights is different from most ghost stories because the hero looks for a ghost instead of trying to escape one, it does have some important elements in common with other ghost stories. As we discussed, a common convention in ghost stories is ambiguity, which we recall is defined as uncertainty and inexactness, particularly in language. Ambiguity is a very logical convention for ghost stories because there is often one character, or sometimes a few characters, who see the ghost and everyone else questions their existence. So is Wuthering Heights haunted? Does Lockwood actually see Catherine's ghost, or does he just think he does because he's exhausted and has heard rumors of the estate being haunted? Is Heathcliff ever reunited with Catherine's ghost? Well, no one knows. The novel is written in such a way that the ambiguity is never resolved. Another aspect that Wuthering Heights shares with other ghost stories is the trope of relating the tale through the mouth of a character that we don't know for sure is reliable. Now, I should give you the definition of a trope. A trope is defined in literature as a recurring motif, a set of circumstances that often appears in a particular genre. Let's take a kind of a familiar one. You might recall from the discussion of slasher movies in Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue that the comment is made that vice precedes slice and dice. Particularly in the Halloween and Friday the 13th series of movies, teenagers usually use drugs or had sex before being brutally and bloodily murdered. Okay, that's a trope. It happens so often that it's almost predictable. Now, most of the story in Wuthering Heights is related by Nellie, who is Catherine's maid more or less throughout her life, and she also becomes a mainstay at Wuthering Heights after Catherine dies. Now, it's kind of a commonplace that servants know everything that goes on an estate. But particularly in older literature like Wuthering Heights, they're generally not considered completely reliable. They're less educated, and they tend to be more superstitious. Even in The Castle of Otranto, the very first Gothic novel, the ghost is seen mainly by servants. An even better example appears in A Turn of the Screw, a really fantastic ghost story written by Henry James that's told by someone who heard it from someone who heard it from the governess. And it's the governess who believes that she sees ghosts. Does she see ghosts, or is she a little off her rocker? Well, we never really know. And just how tragic that story is depends on whether we think she has or think she's a couple of bricks short. But in Wuthering Heights, Nellie herself never actually thinks she's seen Catherine's ghost. Is there a ghost? We don't know. We never know, and that is ambiguity. But as we've discussed, the surface horror in Gothic or horror literature is only part of the story. We appreciate horror more if we look a little deeper to identify what the work tells us about the horror of the human condition. One particular horror that is on the surface in some ways, but deeper in others in Wuthering Heights, is the horror of cruelty. Left on the street as a small child, Heathcliff faces horrors and cruelties that we're not told about, but we can imagine. Being homeless is a cruel existence for anyone, but can you imagine how horrible it would be to be a child left homeless and uncared for on the streets? Well, then Heathcliff is rescued by Catherine's father and knows some years of relative peace and happiness. But when Catherine's father dies and Hindley Earnshaw inherits Wuthering Heights, he allows Heathcliff to stay there only as a servant, and he treats Heathcliff really cruelty. In addition, now some people argue the opposite, but I think Catherine's treatment of Heathcliff is cruel. She loves him tremendously. In fact, when she tells Nellie that she has decided to marry Edgar Linton, Nellie asks her about her feelings for Heathcliff. And her response is, "He's more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same." Okay, she feels just as strongly for Heathcliff as he does for her, but she marries another man. Now, she tells Nellie that she's doing it so that she can help Heathcliff rise higher. But if their souls are the same, she has to understand that he's not nearly as concerned with his social status as he is with having Catherine with him always and forever. But Heathcliff is not only the victim of cruelty in Wuthering Heights, he's also the major perpetrator of cruelty that is presented on the surface of the story. After Catherine's brother Hindley's wife dies, he falls into alcoholism, which is urged on by Heathcliff. Then Heathcliff involves a drunken Hindley in a series of poker games, and he eventually takes everything that Hindley has. Then, in addition, Heathcliff marries Edgar's sister out of spite, and he abuses her physically, verbally, and emotionally. That couple has a very sickly son that he then marries off to Catherine and Edgar's daughter just in order to gain control of Thrushcross Grange and everything that the Lintons own. And as we mentioned, he sees everyone around him as a distraction in his search for Catherine's ghost. So he's cruel to his son, to Catherine's daughter, and, we also learn, to Hindley's son. The overall question this leads us to about life as human beings is whether cruelty simply leads to more cruelty. Emily Bronte seems to say yes. Modern sociologists and psychologists seem to agree. Yet we continue to see punishment as a way to deal with people who violate society's rules. Particularly in the growing field of corporate-owned prisons, there's little attempt to rehabilitate. Why? Does rehabilitation work? Is it better to make prisons so dreadful that people behave themselves in order to avoid going back? Or do we punish people out of a sense of vengeance, like Heathcliff punishes Hindley and the Lintons? Is that right or wrong? But Wuthering Heights presents us with another dilemma that can be part of the horror of the human condition. Like the horrors that can result from cruelty, the horrors associated with love also center on Heathcliff. As we've seen, Heathcliff becomes a cruel man, at least partly as a result of the cruelty heaped on him because he has no love as a small child, is, at least in his view, betrayed by the woman he loves more than life, and is hated by her brother. Would Heathcliff have been as cruel if he had had more love in his life? Well, we can't know because that's not the novel Emily Bronte wrote. But it is a question we deal with in dealing with both children and adults who behave in ways that are unaccepted in our culture. Okay, we can probably agree, at least in principle, that there isn't enough love in the world. But Wuthering Heights also demonstrates that there can be too much love. As we said, Catherine's marrying Edgar almost destroys him. But it's the obsessive love that he is tortured by after her death that pretty much finishes him off. Does he love Catherine too much? Would he and everyone around him be better off if he lets go of his love for her? Again, we don't have that novel to read, but it's hard to avoid the question when we read the entire novel that we do have. So where does that leave us? Too little love can create horror. Too much love can create horror. What is the right amount of love? That seems like a really silly question. But how much of our life do we spend trying to find love that doesn't hurt us? Well, I think that gives us something to think about. And you thought ghost stories were only about ghosts. If you have any questions, of course, you know all you have to do is drop me an email through Canvas. I always love hearing from you guys, and you know I want to help you any way I can. We'll talk again soon, and in the meantime, I hope your life is filled with just the right amount of love to make you happy.